you have this death sentence.
Yeah.
And before we get to the recovery and the turn, like, what was it like facing your mortality?
I was mad at old people a lot, like really resentful. I'd be like,
How so?
well, I work
Because they're
almost exclusively. Yeah.
and
Good for
playing
them.
pickleball or
Talking about their retirement accounts.
yeah.
I work in a geriatric profession, so almost everyone that I worked with was also 70 plus. So much must be nice came out of my mouth. So there was a lot of bristling at other people's
Cluelessness.
the deep unfairness of the world. And like just being able to say that was a joy. Just shit talking old people became important to me.
For your mental health.
It
Good.
did. And they were wonderful about it. And kind of became some of my most trusted people to say, because actually they'd lost kids. They'd lived a life. They knew, I mean, some of the most perfect things came out of the mouth of like older colleagues who said things like, I was like, look, I'm just trying to, I said, look, because you feel this panic of trying to freight what is left with all of the meaning, all the experience. You go really bucket listy. And I asked a colleague, I was like, look, I'm not just trying to bargain, but like, I'd really, if I could just get to 50 and then I could launch my kid. I could finally get everything done. And he was like, oh, but Kate, it comes undone. And he's right. Like, you have this feeling like you're always knitting a sweater and then someone pulls a thread and then you're just not wearing a sweater anymore. And that is the idea that progress is always available to you. Like that is just one of the lovely delusions that we have. So acting without the promise of progress is probably one of the most incredible things that I see people do. How do we try even knowing that it might come apart? I think it takes incredible courage.
I have a dear friend who had his wife, who was becoming his ex-wife, and his daughter both got brain tumors. The wife then turned ex-wife passed away. The daughter had it excised and is recovering and doing great. But that action turned him against God. I mean, he literally was like, fuck you.
Yeah.
If there's a God, this is a cruel fucking God.
Yeah.
Fuck you. I don't want anything to do with you.
Yeah.
How would you address that response, which I'm sure part of you wrestled with to some degree?
Around, I mean, that response is so real and so appropriate. And it's the big theodicy, right? Like, how do we live confronted with the fact that evil isn't just like dictator far away. It's the evil that comes to our doorstep and robs us in daylight. Like that ability, that anger, I have so much respect for. And most of my anger was directed toward platitudes, and most of my career now is directed toward the rage I have about platitudes. So dismantling the things that make it even more painful for someone like that, where it's supposed to be worth it, or he learned lessons, or God's making angels, or it's just, the suffering are mired in bullshit. So yes, when someone says,
very understandable,
it is a
very relatable.
And I also think it's different to be the sufferer and to be the one who is standing there having to live after. And the sufferer and the caregiver are often on very different planets. And so I think I saw some of that anger in the people in my life that I didn't experience because I was,
right.
I felt
I hadn't really thought
loved.
about that.
I felt like I was being brought into, I was just having to learn a different story where
did some of your caregivers struggle more than you did as the sufferer?
They did.
Yeah.
And then just differently. I mean, really differently. And like, I tried to have this conversation with my dad right now about that topic. And I was sitting on the floor, leaning against his knee, and he had his hand on my head. And I was like, Dad, did you think like, why did this happen to my daughter? Like, what could I He was like, oh man, he was like, I was so angry. I thought like, man, if there's like, God, just take it away from her and give it to me. And I was like, Dad, that's like a really lovely thing to say. And he's like, well, but then I think about how Mozart died in his 20s. And I was like, well, and I could tell he was as if he's weighing these two thoughts with both hands. And I was like, maybe we could just go back to loving each other in silence for a while. And when someone gets to a place of like, God, fuck you, this is also saying, I think is, this is truly unbearable. And like, how am I supposed to live my whole life this way? So, whereas I was so desperate and sad trying to figure out how to say goodbye, especially to my son, and also feeling like what I was trying to do was learn the story that it might be okay spiritually in a big story about how God draws all things to God's self and makes the world beautiful. But it's not going to be okay for me in the way that I hoped. And like living with that, like it still had some kind of like, there was just a lot of love there. I think dying is weird. And I think as you're dying, there's some strange comforts there that are not the same ones that are afforded to those who are watching you die.
Yeah, that's a great way of encapsulating it.
The Soul Boom Podcast. Subscribe now on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else you get your stupid podcasts.